Ibrahim Traore turned Burkina Faso into Africa's richest country. The elegant conference hall in Ouagadougou fell silent as President Ibrahim Traore strode confidently to the podium. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the gold-trimmed emblem of Burkina Faso that hung behind him. A golden shovel crossed with a rifle, symbolizing the twin pillars of the nation's remarkable transformation. Ambassadors from across Africa and beyond shifted nervously in their seats. Some maintained diplomatic smiles, while others made little effort to hide their concern. The world's financial press leaned forward in anticipation, cameras clicking rapidly to capture this historic moment. Behind Traore, a digital display showed Burkina Faso's latest economic figures, growth rates that had shattered all projections for the fifth consecutive year. At 38, Traore cut an imposing figure despite his youth. His military bearing remained evident in his posture, though he now wore an elegantly tailored suit rather than the fatigues that had once been his uniform. His eyes, deeply intelligent and perpetually watchful, surveyed the audience before he began to speak. 7 years ago, they told us it couldn't be done. He began, his voice resonating through the hall with quiet authority. The Western financial institutions said our plans were economically irrational. The colonial powers told us we needed their expertise, their loans, their conditions. He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air. The mining conglomerates threatened to leave and take their expertise with them. A knowing chuckle rippled through the African delegates. They had all heard similar threats in their own countries. Today, I stand before you to announce that Burkina Faso has surpassed South Africa and Nigeria to become the wealthiest nation in Africa by GDP per capita. Murmurs spread through the audience. Though the economic data had been trending in this direction for months, hearing it stated so plainly sent a shock through the assembly. Our gold, once stolen from us, now builds our schools. Traore continued, his voice gathering strength. Our cotton, once priced by foreign markets, now clothes our people. Our story is proof that African nations can chart their own course, free from neocolonial exploitation. The African delegates rose to their feet almost as one, applause thundering through the hall. Even some Western representatives joined, albeit more tentatively. The Brazilian ambassador, representing a BRICS nation that had been among the first to support Burkina Faso's new economic model, stood and applauded enthusiastically. Traore raised his hand, and the room gradually quieted. This is only the beginning, he said, his voice now softer but somehow more intense. The path we have blazed can be followed by any nation willing to reclaim its sovereignty. The future belongs to those who control their own resources and determine their own destiny. As the hall erupted once more in thunderous applause, Traore allowed himself a moment of reflection. The journey to this point had been arduous, dangerous, and at times seemed impossible. For a brief moment, his mind traveled back to where it had all begun, 7 years earlier, when he was not yet president but a young captain faced with a momentous choice. September 2022. Captain Ibrahim Traore sat in a dimly lit military office, the only illumination coming from the desk lamp that cast a yellow glow over the classified economic reports spread before him. At 34, he was younger than most officers of his rank, his rapid rise through the military hierarchy a testament to both his tactical brilliance and his unflinching patriotism. As he flipped through the pages of data, his expression grew increasingly grim. The statistics told a devastating story, one of systematic plunder disguised as economic partnership. Outside, the sounds of Ouagadougou at dusk filtered through the windows. Street vendors calling out their wares, motorbikes buzzing through crowded streets, the distant thump of music from a neighborhood celebration. The ordinary rhythm of life in a country whose people had no idea of the true extent of what was being taken from them. These figures can't be correct, Traore said finally, looking up at the economic advisor who stood nervously across the desk. 67 tons of gold produced last year, and only $544 million in government revenue? That's less than 15% of the actual value. Ahmed Ouedraogo, a serious man in his 50s who had served as an economic analyst in various governments, nodded gravely. The contracts were signed by previous administrations, Captain. Under intense pressure from international financial institutions, I might add. The mining companies take 85% of profits out of the country. Legally, according to the agreements. Legal theft is still theft, Traore muttered, turning to the next report. And the cotton industry? Ouedraogo's expression became even more somber. Even worse, we export raw cotton at prices set by international commodity markets, where speculation and subsidies in wealthy nations keep prices artificially low. Then we buy back finished textiles at 20 times the price. We grow it, but we don't own it. Traore pushed back from the desk and stood, walking to a large map of Burkina Faso that hung on the wall. The country he had sworn to protect, the land of upright people, as its name translated, was rich in resources but devastated by poverty. He traced his finger over the gold-producing regions, the cotton fields, the areas where newfound deposits of manganese and other critical minerals had recently been identified. Our people are sitting on some of the richest gold deposits in Africa, yet they live in poverty, he said quietly, more to himself than to Ouedraogo. Nearly 40% of our population below the poverty line while foreign corporations extract our wealth. We're ranked 185th out of 193 countries on human development. The system was designed to be extractive, Captain, Ouedraogo replied. Since colonial times, little has changed except the paperwork. Traore's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The call was on speaker, and the French accent was immediately identifiable. Captain Traore, this is Jean-Pierre Moreau from the French Embassy. I'm calling regarding the concerns our mining consortium has expressed. The new regulations you're proposing would violate our existing agreements and force us to reconsider our investments in Burkina Faso. Traore exchanged a glance with Ouedraogo before responding. Your investments have left our country poorer after decades of extraction. The agreements you mention were signed under duress by corrupt officials. Be reasonable, Captain. Moreau's voice took on a condescending tone that made Traore's jaw tighten. Without our technical expertise, financing, and global market access, your mining sector would collapse. You need us more than we need you. There are many other countries eager for foreign investment. Is that a threat, Monsieur Moreau? Traore asked, his voice becoming dangerously quiet. It's economic reality, Moreau replied smoothly. The IMF and World Bank have already expressed concerns about your government's direction. Loan conditions may need to be reassessed. I'm simply trying to help you understand the implications of your proposed policies before you make a regrettable decision. Traore ended the call abruptly, the room falling into a heavy silence. Both men understood what had just happened. A thinly veiled threat from the former colonial power, delivered with diplomatic polish but unmistakable in its intent. They think we're just another regime they can control with financial threats, Traore said finally, his expression hardening with resolve. They're wrong. Summon the cabinet ministers. We're implementing the new plan immediately. Ouedraogo looked startled. The full resource sovereignty plan? But Captain, we estimated we would need at least 6 months of preparation before. We don't have 6 months, Traore interrupted. They're already mobilizing against us. If we wait, they'll replace us with more compliant leadership. He looked back at the map of his country, his determination solidifying into certainty. The time for half measures is over. Burkina Faso will control its own resources, or I will die trying to make it so. As Ouedraogo hurried to follow his orders, Traore remained before the map, his mind racing through the challenges ahead. He had known that challenging the established economic order would provoke a reaction, but the swiftness and directness of the threat confirmed his suspicions. The foreign interests that had enriched themselves at Burkina Faso's expense would not relinquish their privileges without a fight. So be it, he thought. They would soon discover that the land of upright people would stand tall against all pressure. A plan had been forming in his mind for years, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. That moment had now arrived. 1 month later, Traore stood before a room filled with the country's top geologists, engineers, and military strategists in a secure underground facility beneath the military headquarters. The space had once been a colonial-era bunker, a fitting location for planning what amounted to an economic declaration of independence. Laid out on the long table were detailed geological surveys, mining assessments, and agricultural production plans, the blueprint for a transformed Burkina Faso. The faces around the table were serious but determined, each person selected for both their expertise and their unwavering loyalty to the country. Our biggest advantage, Traoré began, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete chamber, is that they've underestimated us. For decades, they viewed Africa as nothing but a source of raw materials and cheap labor. They've never considered that we might have the knowledge and ability to manage our own resources. He pointed to a senior man in traditional dress sitting quietly in the corner. Despite his age, well into his 70s, Professor Musa Sawadogo's eyes were sharp and alert beneath his white eyebrows. Professor Sawadogo here graduated top of his class in mining engineering at Moscow State University in the 1980s. While our colonial masters thought he was merely an academic archiving our geological history, he was documenting every ounce of gold leaving our country. 20 of our brightest young engineers studied under him in secret while working for the foreign companies. Professor Sawadogo nodded, his dignified face creasing into a slight smile. We have detailed knowledge of every major deposit. We know exactly how the extraction works, how the refineries operate, and how the international markets value our resources. We have been preparing for this moment for years. Traoré unfolded a large map showing gold deposit locations across the country, marking sections with red circles. The mining companies believe we don't know the true extent of our gold reserves. Their geological surveys have been falsified to justify lower royalty payments and conceal the full value of what they're extracting. Our own surveys, conducted covertly by Professor Sawadogo's students, show deposits 60% larger than officially reported. A murmur ran through the assembled experts. Many had suspected such deception, but seeing the evidence laid out so clearly was still shocking. Traoré turned to a woman in military fatigues, her posture as straight as her gaze was steady. Colonel Amina Zongo had earned her reputation through her brilliant handling of counterterrorism operations in the north. Less known was her secondary specialization in resource security. Colonel Zongo has been training a specialized security unit to protect our natural resources for the past 5 years. 300 soldiers with advanced degrees in engineering, finance, and law. Professionals who can not only secure a mine but understand exactly what they're protecting. Colonel Zongo nodded crisply. We're ready to secure our mines and borders when the nationalization begins, sir. The units are positioned across the country, awaiting the signal. And our cotton industry? Traoré asked, turning to the agricultural minister, a former farmer who had risen through the ranks of agricultural cooperatives before entering government. We've been quietly developing our own processing capacity with help from our partners in the East, the minister replied. Small facilities disguised as warehouses, staffed by technicians trained in Turkey and China. We can process 30% of our cotton domestically immediately, scaling to 80% within 3 years. Perfect, Traoré nodded, satisfied. The final piece is our diaspora. Thousands of Burkinabe professionals are waiting to return. Doctors, engineers, financiers who have been working in Western countries, learning their systems from the inside. They're ready to come home when we give the signal. He took a moment to look at each person around the table, these patriots who had worked in silence for years, waiting for this moment. Our colonizers built systems to extract our wealth while making us believe we needed them to manage it. That myth ends now. We have the knowledge. We have the people. We have the resources. He paused, his voice dropping to an intense near whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. What we're about to do isn't just about economics. It's about proving that Africans can control their own destiny. It's about showing our children that they need not accept a place at the bottom of the global hierarchy. It's about reclaiming not just our resources, but our dignity. The room was silent, the weight of the moment palpable. These men and women understood the risks they were taking, not just professionally but personally. Powerful interests would not surrender their privileges easily, and history was littered with the fates of African leaders who had challenged Western economic dominance. There will be consequences, Professor Sawadogo said finally, his voice weathered but unwavering. They will try to stop us with every tool at their disposal. Let them try, Traore replied, his determination absolute. We have something they don't understand and cannot defeat. The righteous fury of a people who have been exploited for too long. We fight not just for ourselves, but for generations unborn who deserve to inherit a free and prosperous Burkina Faso. As the meeting continued deep into the night, detailed plans were finalized for what would become known as the Economic Liberation Initiative. The first phase would begin in exactly 1 week, a coordinated action that would shock the international community and begin Burkina Faso's journey toward true independence. None of those present harbored any illusions about the difficulties ahead. But in that underground room, a sense of possibility took root. The shared belief that their nation's destiny was, at last, in their own hands. The implementation of Traoré's plan began with precision and secrecy. Before dawn on what would later be celebrated as Liberation Day, specialized military units secured key mining operations across the country. Foreign managers woke to find their offices cordoned off, their communications temporarily restricted, while Burkinabe engineers seamlessly took control of operations. In Ouagadougou, a series of decrees were published simultaneously. The nationalization of all major mines, the establishment of a new resource governance framework, the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, and the cancellation of extractive contracts deemed contrary to national interest. The international reaction was immediate and furious. Western governments condemned the illegal seizure of private assets. The financial press predicted economic collapse. Former colonial powers threatened sanctions and intervention. But the mines kept operating, the gold kept flowing. Only now the proceeds remained in Burkina Faso. In the months that followed, the transformation accelerated. Engineering teams installed new refining equipment, allowing gold to be processed domestically for the first time. Cotton processing facilities were rapidly constructed in major agricultural regions. Formal diplomatic meetings with Russian, Chinese, and Turkish officials resulted in new technical partnerships and market access. A digital financial system independent of Western banking networks was established to circumvent potential sanctions. 6 months into the plan, Traoré faced his cabinet in an emergency meeting. The atmosphere in the presidential situation room was tense, the faces around the table showing both determination and concern. Mariam Sanogo, the newly appointed finance minister and a former economist with the African Development Bank, delivered the first report. Western banks have frozen $400 million of our foreign reserves, she stated, her voice clinical despite the gravity of the news. The IMF has suspended all program support. The French government is pushing for EU sanctions targeting specific sectors of our economy, particularly gold exports and cotton. Hamadou Nikima, the foreign minister who had spent decades in diplomatic service, continued. The Americans are threatening to add us to their countries of concern list, which would restrict technology imports and potentially affect our ability to acquire essential equipment. Traoré listened to the reports with composed attentiveness, showing neither surprise nor dismay. When his ministers had finished, he leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. All expected, he said calmly. Now they show their true face. What about our alternative arrangements? Minister Sanogo's expression lightened slightly. Our new banking partnerships with BRICS nations are operational. The gold-backed financial instruments we've established have maintained their value despite the sanctions. Russia has agreed to the technology transfer for refining operations. China has confirmed the infrastructure development package in exchange for resource guarantees. And the domestic situation? Traoré asked, turning to Adama Ouattara, the interior minister. There have been attempts to instigate protests in the capital, Ouattara reported. Foreign-funded NGOs are spreading claims that the nationalization will cause economic collapse. Some former officials are collaborating with outside interests, promising a return to the old system if the current government falls. And how have the people responded? A slight smile crossed Ouattara's face. With skeptical patience, for the most part. They've heard promises before. But the first benefits are becoming visible: the new community health centers, the subsidized food program, the employment opportunities at the processing facilities. Support is growing, especially in rural areas. The conversation was interrupted when a young woman entered hurriedly with a tablet showing breaking news. "Sir, there's been an attack on the Bungu mine," she reported, her voice tense. "Armed militants. Early reports suggest they've taken hostages." The room fell silent as satellite imagery appeared on a large screen showing the remote mine location in eastern Burkina Faso. Smoke could be seen rising from several buildings. General Konate, the military commander, studied the imagery with narrowed eyes. "This isn't a random terrorist attack. The timing and target are too precise. Someone wants to prove we can't secure our resources." Traore nodded, his expression grave but composed. "Activate the Special Response Unit. Colonel Zongo knows the protocol." He turned back to his ministers as the military officials moved to implement his orders. "This was always about more than Burkina Faso," he said, his voice low and intense. "If we succeed, we create a model that could be replicated across resource-rich African nations. The entire system of resource extraction that has kept our continent poor would be threatened. They can't allow that precedent." Minister Sanogo looked troubled. "The pressure will increase. They'll try to isolate us economically, destabilize us politically, and if that fails, they'll try to remove us by force." Traore completed her thought. "That's why we need to move faster. As of today, we're implementing Phase 2 of the plan. Full nationalization of all major mines. Activate the Diaspora Return Network. And send the diplomatic communique to Mali and Niger regarding our economic alliance proposal." He looked around the room at his team, their faces reflecting both determination and the weight of responsibility. "What we're fighting for goes beyond our borders. This is about proving that Africa can be self-sufficient and prosperous on its own terms. If we falter now, it won't just be Burkina Faso that pays the price. It will be the hope of economic sovereignty for 1 billion Africans." The attack on the Bungu mine was repelled within hours, with all hostages rescued and minimal casualties. But it marked the beginning of a new phase in the struggle, one that would test the resolve of Burkina Faso's leadership and people to their limits. In the weeks that followed, the pressure mounted from all sides. International media ran constant stories about the economic disaster unfolding in Burkina Faso, despite growing evidence to the contrary. Neighboring countries faced intense diplomatic pressure to isolate the rogue regime. Mysterious technical failures plagued newly established facilities. Yet for every challenge, Traoré's team found a solution. When banking sanctions tightened, they accelerated the development of their independent financial system. When critical supplies were blocked, they established new trade routes through allied nations. When sabotage targeted infrastructure, local communities organized to protect key assets. The struggle was no longer just about economic policy. It had become a battle for the soul of a nation, and increasingly, for a new vision of what Africa could become. 2 years passed, years of struggle and transformation that tested the mettle of both leadership and citizens. The large situation room in the presidential palace, once a place of crisis management, had evolved into the nerve center of national reconstruction. Digital displays showed economic data, security situations, and international developments in real time, monitored by a team of analysts recruited from both within Burkina Faso and its growing diaspora return program. Traoré, looking more weathered but with an unwavering sense of purpose, addressed his expanded team of ministers, advisors, and technical experts. The initial group of loyalists had grown into a sophisticated governance apparatus, blending expertise with patriotic commitment. Despite all attempts to derail us, Phase 2 has exceeded projections, Traoré stated, gesturing to the central display where economic indicators glowed encouragingly. Gold production up 32%. Domestic processing of cotton at 75%. Agricultural output increased 40% through our collectivized farm program. The data told a story that contradicted every dire prediction made by international financial institutions when Burkina Faso had embarked on its path of resource sovereignty. Rather than collapse, the economy had experienced unprecedented growth, though not without significant challenges along the way. Traoré moved to a large wall map showing the Alliance of Sahel States, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger highlighted in green, their borders now more permeable to movement and trade than ever before. Our regional alliance has created a market of over 70 million people, allowing us to achieve economies of scale that were previously impossible. Our joint currency, backed by gold reserves, has maintained stability despite international pressure. Dr. Sanogo, who had proven herself an economic strategist of remarkable ability during the crisis years, added her assessment. The most remarkable achievement has been the domestic capital formation. By retaining resource profits within our borders and implementing the mandatory reinvestment program, we've built up $12 billion in development funds without foreign debt. And the ECOWAS situation? Traoré asked, referring to the regional economic body that had initially sanctioned Burkina Faso for its economic policies. Since our withdrawal, they've attempted economic isolation, the foreign minister reported, but our new trade routes through Algeria and Libya to the Mediterranean have proven effective. Additionally, our strategic partnerships with Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran have provided technological support that Western sanctions couldn't block. A young technician approached with data on a tablet, her confidence reflecting the meritocratic system that had replaced the patronage networks of the past. Sir, the first shipment from the new rare earth metals processing facility is ready for export. Estimated value is $380 million. Excellent, Traoré nodded. Direct those funds to the semiconductor plant construction. He turned to the education officials present, his expression softening slightly. Education had always been his passion, the key, he believed, to ensuring that Burkina Faso's transformation outlasted any individual or government. Where do we stand with the Technical Education Initiative? The Education Minister, a former university professor who had returned from Canada to join the new government, smiled with evident pride. The first 10,000 students have completed the advanced training program. 50 new technical colleges are operational. Literacy rates have increased from 41% to 68% in just 2 years, the fastest improvement in Africa's history. Traoré nodded, then turned to the agricultural minister. And how is our agricultural revolution progressing? The transition to sustainable farming practices has increased yields while reducing dependency on imported fertilizers, the minister reported. The water management system has made us resilient to drought. Food security has been achieved for the first time in our history. Traoré walked to a large window overlooking the capital city. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, not building luxury apartments for foreign executives as in the past, but hospitals, schools, factories, and housing for ordinary citizens. The transformation was visible, tangible, undeniable. When we began this journey, he said quietly, they said African nations couldn't develop without foreign aid and expertise. They said our people lacked the capacity to manage complex industries. They said our only path was to accept an inferior position in the global economy. He turned back to the room, his expression intense. We've proven them wrong on every count, but our vision goes beyond economic metrics. We're building a new kind of society, one where resources serve the people, not foreign shareholders. One where development is measured in human dignity, not just GDP. He pointed to a digital map showing infrastructure projects across the country, a network connecting every region, every village to the national renaissance. The final phase begins now: universal health care, free technical education for every child, modern infrastructure connecting every village, and most importantly, a democracy built on economic sovereignty, where foreign money can never again buy our politicians or dictate our policies. The room erupted in determined applause, not from blind loyalty but from shared purpose. These were people who had withstood international pressure, threats, and attempts at destabilization. They had seen their vision begin to materialize despite all obstacles. The world doubted us, Traoré concluded, his voice resonating with quiet authority. Let them doubt. While they talk, we build. As the meeting dispersed, Traoré remained by the window, contemplating the city below. The transformation was real and accelerating, but he harbored no illusions about the challenges still ahead. The forces that had profited from Africa's exploitation for centuries would not surrender without a final confrontation. And that confrontation, he knew, was coming soon. 5 years into Traoré's plan, the Grand Hall of the United Nations in Geneva buzzed with tension. Arranged in a horseshoe configuration, the delegates from major global powers, international financial institutions, and multinational corporations faced the small Burkinabe delegation. At the center of it all sat Ibrahim Traoré, now internationally recognized as the architect of what some called the Burkina Miracle, and others termed resource nationalism gone wild. The emergency summit had been convened to address what Western powers described as the destabilizing economic policies of certain African states, a thin diplomatic veneer for what was really a confrontation with the growing Alliance of Sahel States and their approach to economic development. Christine Lagarde, the veteran IMF director, opened the proceedings with practiced diplomatic grace that barely concealed her condemnation. President Traoré, while Burkina Faso's economic growth has been impressive, your methods have created dangerous precedents. Unilateral contract cancellations, asset nationalizations, withdrawal from established financial frameworks. These actions undermine the rules-based international order that has maintained global stability for decades. Traoré listened attentively, his expression giving away nothing. When Lagarde finished, he leaned slightly toward his microphone. The rules-based order you mention was designed when my country was still a colony, he replied, his voice measured but unwavering. We never consented to rules that guarantee our permanent exploitation. When a game is rigged from the start, following the rules simply ensures you will lose. His response drew murmurs from around the table. The delegate from South Africa nodded imperceptibly. The Chinese representative maintained an inscrutable expression, though the slight upward curve of his mouth suggested approval. Richard Montague, CEO of Global Resource Extraction, a conglomerate that had once controlled 3 of Burkina Faso's largest mines, spoke next, his American accent sharp with indignation. Our companies invested billions developing Burkina Faso's mining sector. The expertise, technology, and market access we provided built your gold industry from nothing. The arbitrary seizure of these assets has sent a chilling message to investors worldwide. Traoré's response was immediate and precise, supported by data projected onto screens around the hall. Your companies extracted over $25 billion in gold, while paying less than $3 billion in taxes and royalties over 30 years. The technology you provided was outdated by global standards and designed to maximize your profits, not our development. As for expertise, the engineers running our mines today are all Burkinabe, many of whom were systematically denied advancement while working for your corporations. He gestured to a graph showing production and profit figures before and after nationalization. Under national management, efficiency has increased by 22%, workplace accidents have declined by 65%, and environmental compliance has reached 100%. These facts contradict every warning about the supposed inefficiency of African management. The European Union's commissioner leaned forward, her expression severe. Your government's alignment with Russia and China threatens security cooperation that has kept the Sahel region stable. The military alliance you've formed with Mali and Niger undermines regional security frameworks that have been carefully constructed over decades. At this, Traoré allowed himself a brief, incredulous laugh. Stable? Under your security cooperation, terrorist attacks increased yearly. Foreign bases on our soil did nothing to protect our people. Since taking control of our own security and forming the Alliance of Sahel States, terrorist incidents have declined by 71%. These are your own intelligence agency's figures, not ours. He gestured to a map showing security incidents across the Sahel region before and after the formation of the alliance. The contrast was striking. As for our diplomatic and economic partnerships, we engage with nations that treat us as equals, not subordinates. Unlike our former relationships with Western powers, our agreements with Eastern nations include mandatory technology transfer, training programs, and equitable profit sharing. The World Bank representative, a distinguished economist from India who had often been critical of Western dominance in global financial institutions, nonetheless felt compelled to raise concerns. Without access to international capital markets, your development will eventually stall. No country can grow in isolation, especially one facing the climate and geographic challenges of the Sahel. Traoré nodded respectfully before responding. We don't seek isolation, we seek fair partnerships. Our trade with African nations has increased fivefold. Our economic alliance now includes 7 countries with a combined population of 150 million. We've established new financial relationships across the global south. The issue is not that we reject international cooperation. It is that we reject exploitation disguised as cooperation. He placed a folder on the table and slid it forward. The simple action somehow commanded the attention of the entire hall. This contains our terms for renewed economic relations, equal partnerships, technology transfer, fair profit sharing, environmental protections with actual enforcement mechanisms. These are non-negotiable. The French diplomat, a veteran of decades of neo-colonial management in Africa, scoffed openly. These demands are unrealistic. No company would accept such terms. Traoré's eyes hardened slightly, though his voice remained calm. They already have. Last month, we signed new agreements with corporations from India, Brazil, and yes, even some European countries who recognize the changing reality. They're already operating profitably under these exact terms. He stood, commanding the attention of the room with his presence rather than volume. For centuries, Africa has been told to wait. Wait for development, wait for technology, wait for a fair chance in the global economy. That time of waiting is over. If you cannot accept fair partnership, we will continue our path without you. After all, we've proven we can. The Western representatives exchanged concerned glances. A U.S. diplomat leaned toward his colleague, his whisper just audible in the momentary silence. We've lost them completely, and others are watching. Traoré surveyed the room, his gaze moving from face to face. We came today not as supplicants, but to offer you a choice. Join us in building a new model of international cooperation, or be left behind as the world changes around you. The decision is yours, but do not mistake our extended hand for weakness. Burkina Faso will never again sacrifice its sovereignty or its people's well-being for foreign approval. As he returned to his seat, the hall erupted in a mix of applause, murmurs, and tense silence. The confrontation that many had predicted would break Burkina Faso had instead revealed a fundamental shift in power dynamics. The small landlocked nation once dismissed as hopelessly impoverished had demonstrated not just economic resilience but a new model of development that threatened the very foundations of the post-colonial economic order. The summit continued for hours afterward, with heated debates and tense negotiations. But as Traoré and his delegation departed that evening, they knew that regardless of what resolutions were passed or agreements signed, a threshold had been crossed. The world had been forced to recognize Burkina Faso not as a desperate supplicant, but as a sovereign nation charting its own course. And across Africa, millions followed the proceedings with growing interest and hope. If Burkina Faso could transform itself, why not their nations too? Present day, 7 years after the beginning of the Economic Liberation Initiative. The grand opening of the Pan-African Technology Institute in Ouagadougou marked the culmination of Burkina Faso's transformation. The ultramodern campus gleamed in the morning sunlight, its architecture a harmonious blend of traditional West African design elements and cutting-edge sustainability features. Built with materials sourced entirely from within the Alliance of Sahel States and constructed by a workforce trained through the National Technical Education Program, the institute embodied the principles that had guided the country's renaissance. Students from across the continent streamed through its doors, their faces bright with the promise of knowledge and opportunity. What had once seemed an impossible dream, a world-class technology institute in one of the world's poorest countries, now stood as a monument to what Africans could achieve when they controlled their own resources and destiny. Ibrahim Traore, now in his 7th year as president, surveyed the scene with quiet pride. Age and responsibility had added silver to his temples, but his eyes remained as sharp and determined as ever. The journey had not been easy. There had been moments when the forces arrayed against Burkina Faso seemed insurmountable, when sabotage, economic warfare, and even assassination attempts had threatened to derail everything. Yet through it all, the vision had endured and gradually materialized into reality.